When successful black CEO Jeremiah Carter returns to his small hometown, he's targeted by a corrupt and racist sheriff who abuses his authority to humiliate and intimidate him. What starts as a casual visit spirals into a tense and infuriating ordeal, exposing the deep-rooted racism in America and the unchecked abuse of power within the system. As Jeremiah endures public humiliation and injustice, he's forced to confront a town complicit in its silence. This gripping story highlights prejudice, corruption, and the struggles faced by those who refuse to stay silent in the face of systemic racism. The cafe hummed with quiet chatter, the soft clink of ceramic mugs against tabletops mingling with the hiss of the espresso machine. Sunlight filtered through the wide windows, painting streaks of gold across the floor. It was the kind of morning that promised nothing unusual, the kind that invited routine. Janelle Thomas sat at a corner table, a paperback in one hand and a steaming latte in the other. She wore her favorite burgundy sweater, the kind that made her feel both comfortable and unshakable. Her phone buzzed beside her, another email, another meeting, but she ignored it for the moment, letting herself breathe. The entrance bell chimed, its cheerful ring at odds with what followed. 3 men entered the cafe. 2 were in uniform. The third, a man in plain clothes with a sheriff's badge clipped to his belt, moved with the kind of authority that demanded space. His presence cut through the warmth of the cafe like a blade. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Janelle felt it before she saw it. The shift in the air, the invisible spotlight that seemed to settle on her. Her instincts flared, a quiet voice whispering, "Be ready." She lowered her book as the plainclothes officer, Sheriff Walker, stopped near the counter and turned toward her table. His eyes locked onto her. It was like watching a predator fix its gaze on prey. Janelle met his stare with calm detachment. Years of experience had taught her the value of composure. Her heartbeat quickened, but her hands stayed steady. "Excuse me, ma'am," Walker said, his voice loud enough to turn every head. The casual smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Janelle blinked once, slowly, setting her latte down. "Drinking coffee." Walker's smile tightened. He took a step closer, his hand resting near the badge on his belt. "We got a call about someone out of place. That wouldn't happen to be you, would it?" The words landed like a slap, but Janelle didn't flinch. Around them, the cafe grew quieter. People stared but said nothing. She saw it in their eyes, the hesitation, the silent plea not to make this worse. She straightened in her chair, her voice cool and clear. "I don't believe I'm out of place in a public cafe." Walker's brow lifted, his false smile disappearing. "Don't get smart with me." "I'm not," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. "But I also don't owe you an explanation." The air in the cafe felt thicker now, every sound muted under the weight of what was happening. Janelle kept her gaze locked on Walker, refusing to look away. "Listen," Walker said, his voice dropping. "I don't know who you think you are, but people like you—" "Careful," Janelle interrupted, her voice steady and cutting. "Finish that sentence." For a moment, Walker faltered. Just a moment. Then, he leaned forward, towering over her, his face inches from hers. "I don't think you understand how this works," he said softly, his voice dripping with threat. "When I ask a question, I expect an answer." Janelle's jaw tightened. Around her, the silence had become suffocating. She saw people shifting in their seats, their gazes darting toward the door like they wanted to disappear. She hated that silence, that complicity born of fear. It was the silence that let men like Walker believe they were untouchable. "I think you don't understand how this works," Janelle said, her voice firm but calm. She leaned back just enough to show him she wasn't intimidated. "Because you're going to regret this moment." Walker blinked, confusion flickering in his eyes, then anger. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." For a split second, they stared at each other. 2 forces at odds, one unyielding and the other unsure of what he'd just provoked. Then Walker straightened, his smile returning, cold and deliberate. "We'll see about that," he said quietly, turning on his heel. "I'll be seeing you again, ma'am." As he walked out, the 2 officers followed, their silence louder than Walker's words. The cafe door slammed shut behind them, leaving a trail of tension in their wake. Janelle exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling as they gripped her mug. She looked around. People were already turning away, pretending not to see. She knew this moment well. Humiliation, isolation, the sting of being targeted for no reason but the way she looked. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't just another woman he could intimidate and forget. Tomorrow, he'd know exactly who she was. And when the truth unraveled, when his arrogance came back to haunt him, Sheriff Walker would learn what happens when the wrong woman is pushed too far. The steady rhythm of tires rolling over cracked asphalt echoed like a soft drum beat in the quiet town of Millworth. The morning sun hung low, its golden light seeping through the gaps between sagging storefronts and forgotten lampposts, washing the streets in amber and shadow. It was the kind of town where time felt paused, like the past had curled its fingers around the present and refused to let go. A sleek black car, a polished sedan that looked out of place among the pickup trucks and dented sedans lining the curb, pulled to a stop outside Rosie's diner. The car sat there for a moment, idling, as though hesitating to intrude on the stillness. Finally, the door opened, and Jeremiah Carter stepped out. The man was an enigma to Millworth. Powerful, yet humble. Familiar, yet distant. A black man in his early 40s with a tall, athletic build that carried an effortless strength. He wore simple dark jeans, a crisp white button-up shirt, and a gray coat that fell just past his knees. Nothing about his appearance screamed wealth, but if you knew his name, you'd know exactly what he represented. Jeremiah was the Jeremiah Carter. The man who'd made headlines as the founder and CEO of Veritas, one of the nation's most successful social justice foundations over the years. He'd worked tirelessly to dismantle corrupt systems, fund education, and uplift marginalized voices. To his colleagues, he was a visionary. To others, those unsettled by progress, he was trouble. But in this small southern town, Jeremiah Carter was just Jerry. A boy who'd left years ago and come back a man no one fully understood. He closed the car door softly, the engine falling silent, as his driver, an older gentleman named Curtis, remained inside. "You sure you don't want me to come with you, boss?" Curtis asked through the cracked window, his voice low and gravelly. Jeremiah offered a small, reassuring smile, tucking his hands into his coat pockets. "I'm good, Curtis, just grabbing some breakfast." Curtis gave a doubtful nod, but didn't argue. He knew Jeremiah, always calm, always measured, the kind of man who disarmed others by choosing stillness over force. Jeremiah turned toward the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly as he stepped inside. Rosie's Diner had been a fixture in Millworth for decades, the kind of place where people ordered the usual and left cash on the counter without waiting for change. The air carried the smell of sizzling bacon, burnt coffee, and something sweet. Maybe cinnamon rolls, fresh out of the oven. The patrons inside were exactly who you'd expect. Older men huddled at tables, mumbling over folded newspapers, a tired waitress scribbling orders on her pad, a mother shushing a restless toddler in the corner. Heads turned as Jeremiah walked in. Not dramatically, no one stared outright, but there were glances. Curious, suspicious. He didn't look like them. He didn't move like them. Jeremiah scanned the room calmly, offering a polite nod to no one in particular before sliding into a booth near the back. He didn't need a menu. The specials were plastered on a chalkboard near the kitchen, and besides, Rosie's hadn't changed in 30 years. "Morning, sir," came a voice. Jeremiah glanced up to see the waitress, a white woman in her early 50s with frizzy blonde hair and tired blue eyes. Her name tag said, Debbie. She held her notepad loosely, a pencil tucked behind her ear. "Morning," Jeremiah replied smoothly, his voice low and warm. "I'll take a coffee, black, and 2 eggs, scrambled, with a side of grits and toast." Debbie jotted it down without much expression. "All right, anything else?" "That'll do, thank you." She walked off without another word, though Jeremiah caught the way her gaze lingered on him for just a second too long. Jeremiah leaned back in the booth, his hands clasped in front of him, as he looked out the window. Outside, Millworth appeared deceptively calm. The sidewalks were empty, except for a man sweeping leaves into the gutter, and the sky, too blue, too clear, made it easy to forget how complicated this place could be. He'd grown up here, on the east side of town, where the streets were smaller, the houses older, and the people looked more like him. His father had worked the steel mills until they closed, and his mother had taken in laundry to keep food on the table. They were good people, his parents, quiet and resilient. They taught him the value of hard work and dignity. But dignity didn't hold much weight here. Not for black folks. Millworth had always been a place where lines were drawn, even when they were invisible. It wasn't the kind of racism that made headlines. It was quieter. An extra glance when you walked into a store, a slower service at a restaurant, the word boy muttered under someone's breath. That kind of silence could wear a man down, like water against stone. It could make you leave, as Jeremiah once had, with no intention of coming back. And yet, here he was. Debbie returned a few minutes later, setting his coffee down with a soft clink. Jeremiah looked up, catching the wary flicker in her expression before she quickly turned away. "Your food'll be out soon," she said over her shoulder. Jeremiah thanked her, though she was already gone. He sipped his coffee, letting the bitterness ground him, when the door jingled again. This time the atmosphere shifted. Two men walked in, their voices loud and confident. Local regulars, Jeremiah guessed. One was short and heavy-set, wearing a faded blue flannel and a trucker hat. The other was tall, with sharp features and a neatly pressed sheriff's uniform. The latter caught Jeremiah's attention. Sheriff Paul Harris. Jeremiah had seen his name before, once in a news article about restoring order in Millworth's outskirts, and again on a flyer during his drive through town. Re-elect Sheriff Harris, keeping our community safe. Safe for whom? Jeremiah wondered. The sheriff scanned the diner casually, his eyes landing on Jeremiah. He paused, just for a moment, before continuing toward the counter. But that moment told Jeremiah everything. Harris leaned against the counter, speaking to Debbie. The two exchanged a quiet word, before the sheriff's gaze slid back to Jeremiah. It was subtle, but Jeremiah didn't miss it. The quick glance, the slight narrowing of the eyes. "He's trying to figure out who I am." It was the same look Jeremiah had seen 100 times in boardrooms and courtrooms, men trying to assess whether he was worth their time or their attention. Harris didn't recognize him yet, and that was fine. For now, minutes later, Debbie returned with his food. She placed the plate down quickly, avoiding his gaze. Before Jeremiah could thank her, a shadow loomed over the table. Sheriff Harris. "You new around here?" Harris asked, his voice casual, but edged with something harder. He held a mug of coffee in one hand, steam curling around his face. Jeremiah glanced up, meeting the sheriff's gaze. Calm, steady. "Not exactly." Harris tilted his head slightly, his smile thin. "Don't think I've seen you before." "I've been away a long time," Jeremiah replied evenly. "Just visiting." "Visiting who?" Jeremiah's lips curled into a faint, unreadable smile. "No one you'd know." The sheriff's smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. "Well, welcome back. Then folks don't usually come to Millworth without a reason." Jeremiah picked up his fork, holding the sheriff's gaze. "Sometimes a place calls you back." Harris didn't answer right away. The pause hung between them like a frayed thread, the quiet crackle of tension almost audible. Finally, the sheriff nodded, taking a slow sip of coffee before stepping back. "Well, enjoy your meal," he said, the words polite, but hollow. Jeremiah watched as Harris returned to the counter, his eyes still lingering around the diner. The air felt heavier now, as though the room had collectively decided to hold its breath. Jeremiah knew exactly what had just happened. Harris didn't know him, not yet, but he already felt like something was out of place. And in Millworth, out of place could mean trouble. Jeremiah took a deliberate bite of his toast, chewing slowly, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. To anyone watching, he appeared perfectly unbothered, a man enjoying his breakfast. But beneath the calm exterior, his thoughts churned. He knew men like Sheriff Harris, men who carried their authority like a weapon, sharpening its edges against anyone they considered other. Harris had sized him up the moment he walked in, and though he didn't know Jeremiah's name yet, he'd decided something didn't sit right. And in towns like Millworth, suspicion was a dangerous seed. Jeremiah pushed the plate aside, his appetite waning. He'd been gone too long, it seemed, long enough to forget what it felt like to sit in a room and feel watched, to have your every word, every movement weighed and measured by those who expected you to step out of line. The door chimed again, and for a brief moment, Jeremiah hoped it would bring a distraction. Instead, it brought more trouble. 2 uniformed deputies entered, moving with the same casual arrogance as their boss. One was younger, with a crew cut and a permanent smirk. The other, older and broad-shouldered, carried himself with the tired certainty of a man who'd stopped questioning anything years ago. Both wore their badges like shields. Jeremiah's calm remained unshaken, but he could feel the room react. Conversations died down. The mother in the corner pulled her child closer, and Debbie's movements grew quicker behind the counter. The younger deputy, Harlan, scanned the diner as though expecting to find trouble hidden under the napkin dispensers. His gaze finally landed on Jeremiah, and a glimmer of amusement flickered in his eyes. An amusement Jeremiah recognized immediately. He knew what was coming before Harlan even opened his mouth. "Well, what do we have here?" Harlan drawled, making his way over to Jeremiah's booth with exaggerated casualness. "You just passin' through, sir." Jeremiah looked up slowly, meeting Harlan's gaze with measured calm. "Just grabbing breakfast." Harlan tilted his head, smiling like a man who wasn't really smiling. "You know, I don't think I've seen you around before." "Because I haven't been around," Jeremiah replied evenly. "I grew up here, moved away, now I'm back." Harlan let out a low whistle, as though impressed. "Back, huh? Can't imagine what'd bring someone like you back to a place like this." The words were innocent enough on the surface, but Jeremiah heard the venom beneath them. "Someone like you." He could see it in Harlan's eyes, the way they flickered with quiet challenge. Jeremiah set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "Some places call you back," he said softly, echoing his earlier words to Harris. "Some places don't like being called on," Harlan shot back, the smirk widening as though he'd scored some invisible point. The older deputy, McClendon, grunted softly from near the counter. "Enough, Harlan. Let the man eat." Jeremiah's gaze flicked to McClendon, catching the faint discomfort on his face. He wasn't sure whether the man's intervention came from decency or just a weariness with Harlan's antics. Either way, it didn't matter. The message had already been delivered. He wasn't welcome. 10 minutes later, Jeremiah finished his meal and signaled for the check. Debbie approached hesitantly, her eyes darting to the deputies still lingering by the door. "Here you go," she muttered, placing the bill on the table. "You pay in cash or card?" "Card," Jeremiah replied, pulling out his wallet. She hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if to confirm the coast was clear. You'll need to settle that up front." Jeremiah blinked. "I can't pay here?" Debbie shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her discomfort palpable. "Sorry, sir, that's how we do things for, non-regulars." For a brief moment, the room froze in time. Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the anger show. He knew exactly what this was, another test, another way to remind him he was an outsider, someone whose intentions were suspect. He stood slowly, towering over the table as he picked up the check. Around him, he could feel eyes on his back, whispering unspoken judgments. He walked to the counter, where Sheriff Harris had conveniently reappeared, leaning against the register with an air of idle authority. "You done eatin' already?" Harris asked, his tone just a little too friendly. Jeremiah didn't respond. He handed the check and his credit card to Debbie, who fumbled slightly as she took it. The machine beeped loudly, spitting out a printed receipt. Jeremiah signed the slip, his pen gliding smoothly over the paper. As he handed it back, Harris spoke again. "Mind if I ask you a question, Mr.?" Jeremiah turned, his face calm but unreadable. "Carter." The sheriff's brow lifted slightly. "Carter. Huh. Well, Mr. Carter, what kind of work do you do?" There it was. The probing. The fishing for something to confirm the sheriff's suspicion. Jeremiah let the pause linger, letting the tension settle into the cracks of Harris's smile. "I run a foundation," he said finally. "A foundation," Harris repeated, his voice slow, deliberate. "That right. What kind of foundation?" Jeremiah gave him a thin smile, refusing to let the man bait him. "One that does good work." Something flickered behind Harris's eyes, and for a split second, the sheriff's smile faltered. He didn't like not knowing who he was dealing with. Jeremiah tucked his wallet back into his coat pocket and glanced toward the deputies, still lingering near the door. "I'll be on my way now," he said quietly. "Sure," Harris replied, his voice still laced with that fake warmth. "You have yourself a good day now, Mr. Carter." Jeremiah met his gaze one last time before walking past him, his footsteps unhurried, but deliberate. Outside, the chill of the morning air hit Jeremiah like a wall. Curtis was already standing by the car, leaning against the polished door as he watched Jeremiah approach. "You good, boss?" Curtis asked, his expression carefully neutral. Jeremiah didn't answer immediately. He stood still for a moment, glancing back at the diner through the window. Sheriff Harris was still watching him, a shadow of suspicion darkening his face. "I'm fine," Jeremiah said finally, his voice low. He reached for the car door, but paused, his hand resting on the frame. "Curtis?" "Yeah, boss?" "Did you know the sheriff's name before we got here?" Curtis let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Everybody knows Harris man's been running this town for years, more like a king than a sheriff." Jeremiah's lips pressed into a thin line. "A king who doesn't like sharing his throne." Curtis nodded grimly. "That's the problem, boss. You walk in here, a man with power and respect, and they don't know what to do with that." Jeremiah exhaled slowly, the weight of the morning settling on his shoulders. "Yeah," he murmured. "I've seen it before." He opened the car door and slid inside, the soft leather interior wrapping around him like armor. As Curtis started the engine, Jeremiah glanced back at the diner, one last time. Harris was no longer visible, but Jeremiah could feel the man's gaze lingering in the air, heavy and unspoken. The warning. The black sedan rolled quietly through Millworth's narrow streets, past rows of weathered homes and boarded-up stores. Jeremiah's gaze drifted out the window, taking it all in. The cracked sidewalks, the sagging porches, the faces that watched his car pass with silent curiosity. "This town," Curtis muttered, shaking his head as he gripped the wheel. "You know it's not gonna let you just waltz back in, right? Not without a fight." Jeremiah nodded faintly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "They never do." Curtis glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "So what now? You gonna let it slide?" Jeremiah didn't answer right away. He thought of Harris, of Harlan's smirk, of Debbie's hesitation. He thought of how quickly this town reminded him that, to some people, he would always be a man to watch, a man to question. Finally he spoke, his voice steady as stone. "No, I'm not." Curtis grunted approvingly, pressing his foot on the gas as the car picked up speed. The town of Millworth disappeared slowly in the rearview mirror, but Jeremiah knew the real fight hadn't started yet. This was only the beginning. Jeremiah's car pulled up to the town square, where the courthouse loomed over the crumbling streets like an old sentinel. Its white paint faded, columns chipped, an American flag fluttering weakly in the wind. The square itself looked deserted, except for a few cars parked haphazardly near the curb. Curtis parked the sedan along the edge, glancing back through the rearview mirror. "You sure you want to do this, boss?" Curtis asked quietly, his voice edged with concern. Jeremiah unfastened his seatbelt, his gaze steady as he stared at the courthouse steps. "They're not going to stop, Curtis. Not until I show them I won't either." Curtis exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel. "All right, I'll be right here." Jeremiah stepped out of the car, the sharp sound of the door closing echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding buildings. The cold morning air nipped at his face, but his stride was purposeful as he ascended the courthouse steps. He was a man who had walked into tougher rooms, stared down larger enemies, and fought harder battles. But Millworth had a way of feeling different, its resistance heavier, its prejudice quieter, but deeper. The courthouse lobby was a relic of another era, with worn floors and a long wooden bench that sagged slightly in the middle. The clatter of Jeremiah's shoes drew attention from the small group inside. A balding clerk typing at his desk, a pair of young attorneys shuffling paperwork, and a lone deputy leaning lazily against a doorframe. That deputy was Harlan. Jeremiah ignored him at first, his attention focused on the clerk. He approached the counter, pulling out a manila folder tucked neatly under his arm. "Morning," Jeremiah said coolly, placing the folder down. "I'm here to file an official complaint." The clerk looked up slowly, his expression blank. He adjusted his glasses, his beady eyes flicking down to the folder and back up to Jeremiah's face. "You want to file a complaint?" "Yes," Jeremiah replied evenly. "I've detailed several concerns regarding law enforcement conduct in this town. I expect them to be documented and investigated." The clerk hesitated, clearly unsure of what to say. Jeremiah held his gaze, his calm demeanor unshakable, until the clerk finally cleared his throat. "I'll, need to get someone to assist you with that." He gestured vaguely toward the hallway, where Harlan was still watching. "Deputy Harlan'll take care of it." Jeremiah's jaw tensed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned slowly, facing Harlan with a look that stopped just short of challenging. Harlan pushed off the doorframe, an insufferable grin already spreading across his face. "File a complaint, huh?" He whistled softly, shaking his head. "That's bold, Mr. Carter." "Not bold necessary," Jeremiah corrected. "And it's Jeremiah." Harlan snorted. "Sure it is. Why don't you come back here, we'll sort things out." Harlan led Jeremiah into a small windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and dust. A table sat in the center, accompanied by two mismatched chairs. The walls were bare, save for a faded map of Millworth and a clock that ticked just a little too loudly. "Take a seat," Harlan said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Jeremiah sat carefully, placing the folder in front of him. "Let's cut to the chase," Jeremiah began, his tone sharp. "I've included detailed accounts of harassment, intimidation, and abuse from your department." "Whoa, whoa, whoa," Harlan interrupted, leaning back in his chair. "Abuse, that's a pretty strong word." "It's the right word," Jeremiah replied, his voice unwavering. "And Sheriff Harris's behavior at the diner this morning, that's harassment." Harlan's grin faltered for the briefest moment before he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You think you can just walk into my town, throw around big words, and cause trouble?" Jeremiah met his gaze, his composure ironclad. "Your town?" he asked softly. "That's the problem, isn't it? You think this place belongs to you?" Harlan's face darkened, the air in the room thickening with tension. He reached for the folder, flipping it open dismissively. "Let's see what we've got here." Before Jeremiah could stop him, Harlan swept the folder off the table, sending the pages scattering onto the floor. Jeremiah's hands curled into fists beneath the table, but his face remained composed, his breathing steady. Harlan stood, his smirk returning. "Oops. Guess I'm clumsy today." Jeremiah rose slowly, his gaze locked on Harlan's face. "Pick those up." Harlan's smile froze. "Excuse me?" "I said pick them up," Jeremiah repeated, his voice quieter now, dangerously calm. Harlan stepped closer, his chest puffed out. "I don't think you understand where you are." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Jeremiah replied, his voice a blade. "You don't want me here, you don't want the truth here, but it's coming, whether you're ready for it or not." Harlan's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near his belt. The moment stretched unbearably long, a standoff of wills that seemed to thicken the very air. The door swung open abruptly. "What's going on here?" Sheriff Harris's voice boomed as he stepped into the room, his eyes narrowing when he saw Jeremiah standing tall and Harlan hovering too close. "Everything all right, deputy?" Harlan glanced back, his confidence faltering. "Just handling a complaint, sir." Harris's gaze shifted to the scattered pages on the floor, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I see." He turned to Jeremiah, his expression carefully neutral. "Something I can help you with, Mr. Carter?" Jeremiah didn't flinch. "Your deputy's unprofessional behavior speaks for itself." Harris offered a thin smile. "I'll be sure to look into it." Then his tone hardened. "But if you don't have any further business here, I suggest you be on your way." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm not going anywhere, Sheriff." The room seemed to darken, the weight of those words settling like a stone. Harris's gaze locked with Jeremiah's, the two men standing on opposite sides of a divide, neither would step across. Jeremiah bent down to gather his papers, his movements precise, despite the tension radiating through his body. He knew what was coming. The energy in the room had shifted. Harris and Harlan weren't just posturing anymore, they were preparing. Sure enough, as Jeremiah straightened and tucked the folder back under his arm, Harris's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Carter." Jeremiah turned, his chin lifting slightly. "Sheriff? You're under arrest." The words hung in the air like a bomb, sucking the oxygen from the room. For the first time, Jeremiah's mask of calm cracked, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "Under arrest?" Jeremiah repeated. "For what?" Harris took a step closer, his hand resting near his belt. "Disturbing the peace and interfering with law enforcement operations." Jeremiah let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is how you do things here, huh?" Harlan smirked from behind the sheriff. "Welcome home, Mr. Carter." Harris stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around." Jeremiah stood rooted to the spot, every muscle in his body tense. He could feel the anger rising like a tide, threatening to sweep away his resolve. He wanted to fight, to shout, to call out the injustice for what it was. But he knew that was exactly what they wanted. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath and turned around. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around his wrists. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Jeremiah said quietly. "No," Harris replied, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You made the mistake when you thought you could come back here and start something." Harlan grabbed Jeremiah's arm roughly, steering him toward the door. "Let's take a little ride." They marched Jeremiah through the courthouse lobby like a trophy, his hands cuffed behind his back. The clerk, the attorneys, everyone stopped and stared, their faces flickering with shock and discomfort. Some looked away, others whispered behind their hands. Jeremiah held his head high, refusing to let the humiliation break him. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a slap. Harlan pushed him forward, guiding him down the steps toward a waiting patrol car parked right at the curb, deliberately visible to anyone passing by. Curtis stood next to the sedan, his face a mask of rage as he watched the scene unfold. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, stepping forward. "Stay back," Harlan barked, pointing a finger at Curtis. "Unless you want to join him." Curtis clenched his fists, his shoulders trembling with anger. Jeremiah turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. "Curtis," he said evenly. "It's fine, don't." Curtis froze, his jaw tightening as he stepped back reluctantly. The deputies shoved Jeremiah into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with a hollow thud. As the car pulled away, Jeremiah's face remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on the courthouse disappearing in the rearview mirror. They thought they'd humiliated him, broken him, but all they'd done was light a fire. The patrol car bumped along the uneven streets of Millworth, each jolt vibrating through the hard metal seat where Jeremiah sat, his wrists aching against the tight handcuffs. The cold steel bit into his skin, but the discomfort was nothing compared to the fire smoldering in his chest. Harlan sat in the driver's seat, whistling a tuneless melody that grated against the silence. The older deputy, McClendon, sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his face set into a grim, unreadable mask. Jeremiah kept his gaze fixed on the passing buildings, his mind sharpening like a blade. Every crack in the pavement, every hollow-eyed face peering from doorways, reminded him of why he was here, why Millworth's hold on the past couldn't remain unchecked. "Gotta say, Mr. Carter," Harlan drawled, his voice thick with mockery, "you sure do know how to make an impression? What were you hoping for? A hero's welcome?" Jeremiah didn't answer. He wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "Come on now, don't get quiet on me." Harlan glanced back in the rearview mirror, his smirk wide and cruel. "Man like you, big foundation, big money, you think you're better than us, don't you?" Jeremiah turned his head slightly, meeting Harlan's gaze in the mirror with icy calm. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I do think you're worse." Harlan's face twitched, the smirk vanishing. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" Jeremiah asked softly, his voice low and cutting. "You'll rough me up, I wouldn't expect anything less." McClendon shifted uncomfortably, his fingers flexing against the dashboard. "That's enough, Harlan," he muttered. Harlan scoffed, but said nothing else, his hands tightening on the wheel. Jeremiah leaned back, his resolve hardening with every passing moment. They wanted him to feel powerless, to shrink under the weight of their authority, but they'd underestimated him, the same way men like this always did. When the patrol car finally screeched to a stop outside the Millworth Police Department, Harlan dragged Jeremiah out with unnecessary force. Jeremiah stumbled slightly, but straightened quickly, his chin lifting as he walked. They paraded him through the narrow halls like a prize, deputies and staff turning to watch. Their eyes were a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and thinly veiled judgment. A voice rose above the murmurs. Sheriff Harris, waiting near the entrance to the holding cells. "Well, look at you," Harris said, his voice smooth but laced with malice. "Mr. Carter, all locked up doesn't quite fit the image, does it?" Jeremiah met Harris's gaze with steely calm. "This isn't the win you think it is, Sheriff." Harris stepped closer, his presence filling the small corridor. "You really don't get it, do you? You're a thorn in my side, Carter. You come here, stir up trouble, get people riled up, and for what you think you can fix this place. This town doesn't need fixing." Jeremiah's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of his purpose. "This town is broken, Harris, and you know it." Harris's smile froze, his eyes darkening. He stepped back and nodded to Harlan, who yanked Jeremiah's arm roughly. They shoved him into a small holding cell, the door slamming shut with a metallic echo. Jeremiah sank onto the hard bench against the wall, exhaling slowly. The cell was bare. Just a steel bench and a toilet, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. He leaned back, his mind racing. Hours passed. The cell block was silent, except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. Jeremiah sat motionless, his eyes closed, his breathing steady. Outwardly calm, his thoughts burned like embers threatening to catch fire. He thought of his foundation, of the schools he'd helped build, the lives he'd fought to improve. And now, here he was, back in the town that had tried to bury him, handcuffed and locked away like a criminal. The injustice of it all seared his chest, but he refused to let the anger consume him. Anger was the weapon they wanted him to use because it was easier to discredit. Instead, he thought of Curtis, of the people in Millworth who were tired of men like Harris, but too afraid to speak up. He thought of every kid in this town who'd learned too early that their voice didn't matter. "Not anymore," Jeremiah vowed silently. The sound of footsteps broke his concentration. He looked up to see a figure approaching, a middle-aged man with a sharp jawline and a salt and pepper mustache. His eyes were tired but kind. Detective Mitchell. Mitchell was one of the few officers Jeremiah remembered from his youth, back when he was just a boy in sneakers, too big for his feet. Mitchell had been fair then, quiet and steady, a man who did his job without fanfare. Now, he stood outside Jeremiah's cell, his face troubled. "Mr. Carter," Mitchell said, his voice low. "You all right in there?" Jeremiah sat up, his gaze wary but curious. "I've had better days." Mitchell glanced over his shoulder, ensuring the hallway was empty, then stepped closer to the bars. "This doesn't sit right with me. I don't know what Harris is playing at, but this ain't the way things should be done." Jeremiah tilted his head slightly. "Then why are you letting it happen?" Mitchell's face tightened. "It's not that simple. Harris has his hooks in this place. You speak up, you get pushed out. Or worse." Jeremiah stood, his voice quiet but firm. "That's how they keep us quiet, Mitchell fear. And every time someone says, 'It's not that simple,' it gives them more power." Mitchell held Jeremiah's gaze, something flickering in his eyes. Guilt, maybe? Or the beginnings of resolve. "What are you planning, Carter?" Mitchell asked after a long pause. Jeremiah stepped closer to the bars, his tone sharpening. "I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what's happening here. Harris thinks he can humiliate me into silence. But the more he pushes, the more this truth will spread." Mitchell exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You're playing a dangerous game." "He made it a game," Jeremiah shot back. "I'm just making sure he doesn't win." Mitchell looked over his shoulder again, then back at Jeremiah. He lowered his voice. "I'll keep an eye on things, just be careful." "Thank you, Mitchell," Jeremiah said softly, meaning it. The detective nodded, his jaw tight. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the quiet hum of the hallway. Jeremiah was still sitting on the bench when the commotion started. Muffled voices filtered through the halls, raised, tense, and urgent. He straightened, straining to make out the words, but they were too far away. Moments later, Harlan appeared at the cell door, his face red with frustration. "What's going on?" Jeremiah asked, his voice even. Harlan scowled. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" Jeremiah blinked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You'll find out soon enough." Harlan growled, unlocking the cell door. "Get up!" Jeremiah rose slowly, refusing to let Harlan's anger rush him. As they walked back through the hallways, Jeremiah began to notice the urgency in the air. Deputies on phones, others gathered around monitors. When they reached the front desk, Jeremiah saw it immediately. On the TV mounted in the corner, news anchors spoke in hurried voices, the headline flashing across the screen. Prominent activist Jeremiah Carter, arrested in small town, civil rights violations alleged. Footage of Jeremiah being shoved into the patrol car played on a loop, along with clips of Sheriff Harris in the diner earlier that morning. A voiceover narrated the unfolding story, the words, "abuse of power and harassment" ringing clearly. Harlan turned to Jeremiah, his face red with fury. "Who leaked this?" Jeremiah's expression didn't change, though inside, something like satisfaction burned bright. "Looks like the truth has a way of getting out." Across the room, Sheriff Harris appeared, his face dark as thunder. He stormed toward Jeremiah, his steps heavy with fury. "You think this is over?" Harris snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You've made a big mistake, Carter." Jeremiah stood tall, his voice calm and resolute. "No, Sheriff. You did." Jeremiah met Harris's glare head-on, refusing to flinch around them. Deputies whispered. Phones rang, and the TV blared with the story that had just begun to spread. Outside the windows, a small crowd had started to gather, people holding up phones, recording. The tide was turning. And Jeremiah knew the real fight was about to begin. Outside the Millworth Police Department, the crowd had grown. What had started as a handful of curious onlookers had swelled into dozens of people, their murmurs rising into a hum of tension. Phones captured every moment, their lenses unflinching as they recorded the scene. From inside the building, Jeremiah Carter could hear the growing voices, a storm gathering strength. He stood calmly near the front desk, his posture unbowed despite the handcuffs that had only just been removed across from him. Sheriff Harris loomed, his face twisted in barely contained fury. "You think you've won something here, Carter?" Harris growled, his voice low enough that only Jeremiah could hear. "You think dragging my name through the mud is going to change a damn thing?" Jeremiah didn't flinch. "This isn't about dragging you anywhere, it's about dragging the truth into the light." Harris's jaw tightened, a vein bulging near his temple. "You don't belong here, you never did." "That's your problem, Harris," Jeremiah replied, his voice measured but cutting. "You think you decide who belongs, but this town doesn't belong to you, and it never did." A flurry of activity at the door made both men turn their heads. Reporters had arrived, cameras in tow, their lenses glinting as they jockeyed for position. A local news anchor in a navy coat pushed forward, her microphone already live. "Sheriff Harris," she called out, her voice slicing through the air. "We've received reports that activist and philanthropist Jeremiah Carter has been detained without cause. Can you confirm the charges?" Harris turned, his face sliding into a politician's forced smile, though his eyes betrayed the simmering anger beneath. "I won't comment on an ongoing investigation," he said smoothly. "This man has been disrupting the peace and interfering with police business." "Disrupting the peace?" Jeremiah echoed, stepping forward before Harris could stop him, his voice carried across the room, calm but clear. "Is that what you're calling it now? Standing up to corruption, filing complaints about harassment, telling the truth?" The reporters pivoted to Jeremiah, cameras and microphones turning like sunflowers toward the light. "You can't talk here," Harris hissed, his voice harsh in Jeremiah's ear. "Watch me," Jeremiah shot back. Jeremiah stepped to the center of the room, his broad shoulders and steady stance commanding attention. His voice carried through the police station, loud enough for everyone to hear. Officers, reporters, and the people now watching through the glass windows. "This town has been suffocating under the weight of corruption for too long," Jeremiah began, his tone powerful but measured. "For decades, men like Sheriff Harris have weaponized fear and authority to keep people silent, to protect their power, to punish anyone who doesn't fit into their version of who belongs." "Enough," Harris snapped, but his voice couldn't compete with the room's energy. The cameras were on Jeremiah now, and Harris knew it. Jeremiah's gaze swept the station, landing on the younger deputies, the secretaries watching from their desks, and even on Detective Mitchell, who stood quietly near the back of the room. "But the truth is out. This isn't just about me. It's about every person in this town who's been told to stay quiet, every family who's been threatened, every kid who grew up thinking they had no voice. Harris strode forward, jabbing a finger toward Jeremiah. That's enough, Carter. You don't speak for this town. Jeremiah's eyes locked onto his. I don't need to. They'll speak for themselves. As if on cue, the front doors burst open, and a wave of townspeople poured in. More than Jeremiah had expected. People he recognized from his childhood, younger faces he'd never seen, and even those who had avoided him earlier. At the head of the group was Curtis, his voice ringing through the chaos. You're not gonna shut us up anymore, Harris? The sheriff's face blanched, his authority cracking under the weight of the moment. For the first time, he looked unsure. He glanced at the cameras, at the crowd, and back to Jeremiah, as if searching for a way out. Then it happened. A shaky voice rose from the corner. He's right. The room froze. All eyes turned to McClendon, the older deputy, who had remained silent through most of the day. He looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped forward. What did you say? Harris barked, spinning toward him. McClendon swallowed hard but didn't back down. I said he's right. This has gone too far. You're out of line, Sheriff. You don't know what you're talking about, Harris growled, his voice dangerous. You want to throw your career away for him? McClendon looked at Jeremiah, then back at Harris. His voice grew stronger. I'm throwing it away for the truth. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, townspeople murmured in disbelief, and the deputies, most of them, looked at each other with wide eyes, as though Harris's once impenetrable shield had begun to crack. Lies, Harris snarled, turning on Jeremiah. You've poisoned these people against me. No, Jeremiah replied quietly. You did that yourself. Harris snapped, the simmering rage boiling over as he lunged forward, his hand reaching for the baton on his belt. You think you're better than me, boy? Before he could take another step, Curtis and several townspeople pushed forward, forming a protective wall around Jeremiah. Others shouted, and 2 deputies reached out, grabbing Harris's arms. Enough, Sheriff! McClendon shouted, stepping in. Stand down! Let go of me! Harris roared, his face red with fury, but it was too late. The cameras had captured everything, his unhinged fury, his attempt to attack Jeremiah, his desperation as the world began to close in on him. Amid the chaos, Jeremiah remained steady, his voice cutting through the noise like a bell. This is what happens when power goes unchecked, he said, looking at the crowd. This is what happens when silence becomes complicity, but not anymore. The crowd quieted, their focus solely on him now. This isn't just about me, it's about every person in Millworth who has been waiting for justice, who has been waiting to be seen. We can't change what's already been done, but we can decide what comes next. The murmurs grew louder, voices of agreement, of hope. People nodded, some clapping softly, others holding up their phones to stream his words. Live outside, the gathering crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the building. Curtis stepped closer, his voice low but proud. You did it, boss. You cracked him. Jeremiah turned slightly, his face calm but resolute. This is just the beginning. Sheriff Harris, his face pale and his chest heaving, was finally escorted from the building by 2 deputies. The handcuffs that once gripped Jeremiah now locking around his own wrists. Sheriff, any comment? Reporters shouted as cameras flashed. Harris ignored them, his gaze fixed on the ground. Jeremiah watched him go, a faint sadness flickering in his eyes. Men like him never think the day will come, he murmured. Mitchell approached, his shoulders squared as he extended a hand toward Jeremiah. You did the right thing, he said quietly. It's time this department had a reckoning. Jeremiah shook his hand, his grip firm. Make sure it doesn't end here, Mitchell. Mitchell nodded, his face solemn. It won't. As Jeremiah stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the crowd erupted into cheers. People clapped, some shouted his name, and others simply stood in silent gratitude. Curtis joined him, grinning. They're with you now, Jay, Curtis said. Jeremiah surveyed the faces in the crowd, young and old, hopeful and weary. The fight wasn't over, but something had shifted. Then, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his brow furrowing at the unknown number. This is Jeremiah. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper. "You think you've won, Mr. Carter. You don't know the half of it." The call ended abruptly, leaving Jeremiah staring at the screen, the fire in his chest reigniting. "What is it?" Curtis asked. Jeremiah pocketed the phone, his gaze narrowing. "The real fight's just beginning." The air inside the Millworth Police Department felt electric, crackling with tension that made the walls seem to close and officers gathered along the edges of the lobby, some murmuring in hushed tones, while others watched silently, their faces tense. Reporters pressed against the glass outside, cameras flashing as the crowd outside grew louder, a restless hum of anger and anticipation. Jeremiah Carter stood at the center of it all, calm as the eye of a hurricane. Sheriff Harris paced like a caged animal, his boots thudding heavily against the tile floor. His face was flushed, his jaw set tight, as if the weight of his crumbling authority threatened to break him in two. Harlan hovered near the entrance, his smugness replaced by something closer to unease. "You've stirred up a hell of a mess, Carter," Harris said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You really think a bunch of shouting and camera flashes changes anything?" Jeremiah turned slowly, his calm gaze locking onto Harris's furious eyes. "It already has. You're just too stubborn to see it." Harris barked a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and hollow. "Is that what you think, that you can waltz back in here with your big city money and your holier-than-thou attitude and fix things you don't belong here, Carter? You never did." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "You keep saying that, Harris, like it makes you right. But you know what I see when I look at you?" He took a step forward, his voice carrying through the room. "I see a man who's scared of change, scared of losing the power you've used to hurt people for years." The murmurs among the gathered officers grew louder, Harris's fists clenched at his sides. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "Oh, I know enough," Jeremiah replied, his tone sharpening. "I know about the reports that were buried, the families you threatened, the complaints against you that vanished." Harris's face darkened, a flicker of panic crossing his eyes. "You've got no proof." Jeremiah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for everyone to see. "Proof? I've got more than enough videos, testimonies, documents. You really thought I'd come here unprepared?" A ripple of shock ran through the room. Harris's bravado cracked as Jeremiah turned the screen toward the watching officers. It displayed a file list, dozens of names, dates, and recorded incidents. "I've spent the last week digging up what you tried to bury," Jeremiah continued, his voice steady but cutting. "Every threat, every false arrest, every abuse of power. And guess what, Sheriff? You're the common denominator. You son of a—" Harris lunged forward, his face twisted in fury, but before he could close the distance, Detective Mitchell stepped between them. "That's enough!" Mitchell's voice boomed like thunder, stopping Harris in his tracks. His eyes narrowed as he turned to the sheriff. "Don't you dare!" Harris froze, panting, his chest heaving around him, the weight of the room shifted. The officers, once loyal to their sheriff by default, were no longer looking at him the same way a fracture had formed, small but unmistakable. "Get out of my way, Mitchell," Harris growled, his voice trembling. Mitchell didn't move. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "You've lost, Harris. You just can't admit it." "I haven't lost anything," Harris bellowed, spinning around to address the officers and deputies watching him. "This man is a fraud. A liar. He's trying to tear this department apart. Tear you apart." But no one moved to back him. Jeremiah's voice sliced through Harris's rant like a blade. "No, Harris. You did that to yourself. You used fear to keep these people quiet. You counted on their silence to protect you. But they're not afraid of you anymore." From the back of the room, McClendon's shaky voice broke the silence. "It's true." All heads turned to the older deputy. His face was pale, but his words were clear. "The things he's saying, he's not lying. I saw it. I kept my mouth shut when I should have spoken up, but not anymore." "McClendon," Harris snapped, his voice a warning. "Think very carefully about what you're saying." "I have," McClendon shot back. His voice strengthened as he turned to the gathered officers. "We all know what he's done. How many times have we watched him cross the line and said nothing? How many people have suffered because of it?" The room fell deathly silent. The other officers exchanged looks, some nodding faintly, others averting their eyes. Harris's face went pale. "You can't do this." But Jeremiah stepped forward, driving the final nail into the coffin. "They're already doing it." Harris snapped. "You think you can take everything from me?" he roared, his voice breaking. "You think you're gonna walk out of here like some kind of savior?" His hand shot to his belt, fingers closing around the handle of his baton. Before anyone could react, he swung it at Jeremiah in a blind rage. Jeremiah ducked, the baton whistling past his ear. The room erupted in shouts as officers moved forward, but Jeremiah wasn't done. With a sharp pivot, he stepped inside Harris's reach, grabbing his wrist and wrenching the baton from his hand. The weapon clattered to the floor as Jeremiah shoved Harris backward, hard enough to send the sheriff stumbling. "Enough!" Jeremiah's voice thundered through the room. The chaos fell silent. Harris stood panting, disarmed and humiliated. He looked around the room for allies, but found none. The officers who had once followed his lead now stared at him with disgust, disbelief, or shame. Jeremiah tossed the baton aside, his breathing steady as he looked Harris in the eye. "This is over." A chorus of voices followed. "Sheriff, you're out of line," McClendon said sharply. "We can't cover for him anymore," another officer added, his voice wavering but firm. Mitchell stepped forward, placing a hand on Harris's shoulder. "Hand over your badge." Harris's eyes widened. "What, you can't?" "You've embarrassed this department enough," Mitchell said, his voice cold. "It's time." For a moment, Harris looked as if he might resist, but then his shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him in one visible exhale. Slowly, he reached for the badge pinned to his chest, his hands trembling. He ripped it free and slammed it into Mitchell's waiting palm. "You'll regret this," Harris spat at Jeremiah, his voice bitter and broken. "You'll regret every second." Jeremiah didn't respond. He simply stood tall as Harris was escorted out of the building, the sound of his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. Reporters surged forward to capture the moment, their cameras flashing as the doors closed behind him. The tension in the room finally began to ease, replaced with a sense of relief that felt fragile and untested. Mitchell turned to Jeremiah, his expression a mix of respect and exhaustion. "Carter," he said, extending his hand. "You did what none of us had the courage to do." Jeremiah shook it firmly. "You'll have to decide what comes next." Mitchell nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. "We will." Curtis entered moments later, grinning broadly as he clapped Jeremiah on the back. "You all right, boss?" Jeremiah exhaled slowly, finally allowing himself to breathe. "I'm all right." But as they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices carrying across the square. Reporters swarmed forward, shouting questions, while townspeople chanted Jeremiah's name. Curtis glanced at him, his grin fading slightly. "You know they're not done with you, right?" Jeremiah nodded, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the crowd. "I know." His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, a message flashed across the screen. "This isn't over, watch your back." Jeremiah's jaw tightened as he looked out over the cheering crowd. "They're going to fight back," Curtis said quietly. Jeremiah slid the phone back into his pocket, his voice steady. "Then so will we." The video of Sheriff Harris being led out of the Millworth Police Department spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was on every news outlet and social media feed, shared alongside clips of Jeremiah Carter's powerful stand. The footage exposed everything: the assault, Harris's corruption, and the abuses of power that had plagued Millworth for decades. By morning, the weight of public opinion had grown unbearable. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled. People from every corner of Millworth gathered: teachers, business owners, activists, and families, all standing together in solidarity. Their voices rose in chants for justice, carrying through the small town like thunder. Inside, Jeremiah sat across from Detective Mitchell and several state investigators who had arrived overnight. Papers covered the conference table between them: evidence of Harris's buried misconduct, testimonials from victims, and reports long ignored. Mitchell's voice broke the quiet hum. "This goes deeper than we thought." Jeremiah nodded, calm but resolute. "I told you it would." An investigator flipped through the stack of files, shaking her head. "You're lucky you got out of there in one piece. Mr. Carter Harris was a powder keg waiting to blow." "It wasn't luck," Jeremiah replied evenly. It was years of silence catching up to him. Mitchell met Jeremiah's gaze across the table, a look of respect in his tired eyes. They're pulling Harris's file. He'll be facing a state-level investigation. Harlan and a couple of deputies are likely going with him. This department will never look the same again. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair, the weight of those words settling over him. It shouldn't. By afternoon, Jeremiah found himself on the steps of Millworth's courthouse, facing the people he'd fought so hard to protect. Curtis stood at his side, and Mitchell, now officially acting sheriff, lingered just behind him. Cameras flashed, reporters called out questions, but Jeremiah focused on the crowd. The people who had come to see the truth, exposed people who had been waiting for this moment. He stepped to the podium, his voice steady as it echoed across the square. This town has been held back for too long. Fear, silence, and corruption have been used to keep us divided, but we're done being afraid. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of energy surging through the square. Jeremiah continued. We stood together to expose the truth, and we're going to keep standing together. This isn't just about one man, one department, or even one town. It's about what comes next, what we choose to build. His voice grew softer, carrying more weight. Change doesn't happen because of one moment. It happens because people refuse to give up, because we refuse to let injustice win. The applause grew louder, swelling into cheers. Faces young and old nodded, some holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace, and Millworth deserves better." Jeremiah let the moment wash over him, a spark of hope flickering to life. Curtis clapped him on the back, grinning. You got him, Jay, you really got him. That evening, news broke. Sheriff Harris had officially been relieved of his duties. State authorities charged him with abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and multiple civil rights violations. Harlan and 2 deputies were implicated as well, swept up in the investigation. The Millworth Police Department, once untouchable, now stood under state oversight. Jeremiah watched the news unfold from the couch in his small rented house. Curtis sprawled in a chair across from him, flipping through his phone. You did it, Curtis said, looking up. You broke the whole damn system. Jeremiah exhaled, a mix of exhaustion and triumph pressing against his chest. We broke it. I couldn't have done this alone. Curtis's grin faltered slightly. You know it's not over, right? Jeremiah nodded, his gaze fixed on the television screen, where Harris's mugshot filled the frame. It's never over. The real fight, the one to rebuild Millworth into something better, was just beginning. For every corrupt sheriff or deputy exposed, there were more cracks in the system waiting to be mended. Jeremiah knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew they'd planted a seed that couldn't be ignored. The days that followed brought something Millworth hadn't seen in years. Progress. Acting Sheriff Mitchell began cleaning house, re-examining old complaints, reopening investigations, and firing officers who refused to adapt to a new standard of accountability. At a community meeting, residents gathered in the same town hall where Jeremiah had once been turned away. This time, they were here to talk, to heal, and to hold their leaders accountable. Jeremiah sat quietly in the back row, listening as voices rose. An older woman stood first, her voice trembling. For too long we've let this happen, we've let them tell us we don't matter no more. A young man followed, his fists clenched at his sides. My brother spent years in jail for something he didn't do because of men like Harris. We need to make sure that never happens again. One by one, people spoke. Teachers, business owners, teenagers. Their anger was raw, but so was their hope. Jeremiah listened, his heart full, knowing this was what he'd fought for. When Curtis nudged him to speak, Jeremiah shook his head. Not tonight, he said softly. This is their moment. The weeks turned into months. News crews left, protests quieted, but the ripple effects of what Jeremiah had started continued to spread. The Millworth Police Department began working closely with the community, hosting regular forums and workshops to rebuild trust. Officers who once stood silently now stepped forward to speak out against the corruption they'd witnessed, helping clean up a broken system from the inside out. Jeremiah's work didn't stop. He returned to his foundation, using his influence to ensure Millworth schools received funding, its infrastructure improved, and its children had opportunities they'd been denied for too long. He was no longer an outsider. Walking through Millworth streets, People greeted him with nods and smiles, recognition of a man who had stood up when it mattered most. One afternoon, as he stood outside a newly reopened community center, Mitchell approached. "You've done good here, Carter," Mitchell said quietly, extending a hand. Jeremiah shook it, his grip firm. "It's just a start." Mitchell nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes." But not everything was resolved. On a cool evening, Jeremiah sat in his office, reviewing plans for a new housing project, when his phone buzzed. The number was blocked. He hesitated, then answered. "This is Jeremiah." The voice on the other end was low and calm, but laced with menace. "You think you've won, Mr. Carter, but there are others who won't let you change this town." The call ended abruptly, leaving silence in its wake. Curtis entered moments later, oblivious to the tension in the room. "You ready to head out?" Jeremiah pocketed the phone, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, let's go." As they stepped into the night, Jeremiah looked around at the town he'd fought so hard for. The lights of Millworth glowed brighter now, the streets livelier, but he could still feel the shadows lingering on its edges. Curtis glanced at him. "What's next, Jay?" Jeremiah smiled faintly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Whatever comes." Millworth was far from perfect. There would always be those who clung to the past, who resisted change and sought to undermine progress. But Jeremiah Carter had proven that one voice, one stand, could shatter silence. The system hadn't changed overnight, it wouldn't. But the people had started to see their power, and Jeremiah knew that was enough to set everything else in motion. As the sun dipped below the town, casting Millworth in shades of gold and purple, Jeremiah Carter stood tall, ready for whatever came next. The streets of Millworth were quieter now, but the silence wasn't the same. It wasn't the stifling silence of complicity or fear. It was the steady calm of a town beginning to heal. People walked with purpose, their steps a little lighter, their heads a little higher. Change, as slow and uncertain as it often was, had begun to take root. Jeremiah Carter stood at the edge of Millworth's town square, watching children play near the newly refurbished fountain. Their laughter carried on the breeze, a sound he hadn't realized the town was missing until now. Curtis stood beside him, hands in his pockets, his gaze thoughtful. "Crazy to think how far we've come," Curtis said, his voice soft. "This place feels different." Jeremiah nodded, his arms crossed over his chest. "It's not fixed. Not yet." "No," Curtis agreed. "But it's better." Jeremiah let the words settle. It was better. The Millworth Police Department, once an untouchable institution, had been stripped down to its foundation. Sheriff Harris's removal sent shockwaves through the town, a reminder that power without accountability couldn't last forever. A state investigation had revealed decades of abuses, false charges, buried complaints, families ruined for daring to speak out. Those days were over, and in their place was something fragile but promising. Hope. Jeremiah had never expected to become the face of change in Millworth. He'd come back to town to lay flowers on his father's grave and quietly contribute to the community that raised him. But life had a way of pulling people into battles they never sought. The man who stood here now was different from the one who had first walked into that diner. Calmer, stronger, and more resolved. He had come face to face with the ugliest parts of the town's history, and he'd chosen to fight back, not just for himself, but for those who couldn't. Jeremiah had been tested. He had felt the sharp sting of injustice, the heat of anger that simmered just beneath the surface. But through it all, he learned that standing up didn't mean winning overnight. It meant being willing to keep going, to hold steady when the winds pushed against you. "It's funny," Jeremiah said finally, glancing at Curtis. "I spent years building businesses, giving speeches in boardrooms, shaking hands with powerful people, but this feels like the hardest thing I've ever done." Curtis chuckled. "You ain't wrong. You put your whole life on the line for this town." "For what?" "For the people," Jeremiah replied, his voice clear. "For the ones who didn't have a voice, and for the ones who thought no one was listening." Curtis looked at him, admiration flickering in his eyes. "They're listening now." What happened in Millworth was more than one man's fall from power. It was a reckoning, a painful but necessary confrontation with the town's buried truths. People who had spent years in silence were speaking now. They were telling their stories, sharing their pain, and demanding better. The ripple effect spread beyond Millworth's borders. News stations picked up the story, framing it as a microcosm of a much larger struggle. Towns across the state began questioning their own systems, their own leaders. Jeremiah's fight became a symbol, a reminder that change wasn't out of reach if people were brave enough to demand it. But Jeremiah knew the fight wasn't over. Corruption didn't vanish overnight. Prejudice didn't disappear because one man had been removed. The scars Millworth carried, wounds born of generations of silence, would take time to heal. "It doesn't end here," Jeremiah said to Curtis, his voice steady. "There are more towns like this, more people who need someone to stand up." "And you're gonna be that someone?" Curtis asked, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Jeremiah turned to look at him. "I don't know about that, but I'll keep fighting. We all have to." A week later, Jeremiah stood on a small stage in the community center, the room packed with families, activists, and leaders from across town. The energy was palpable. Hopeful but cautious, like a flame just beginning to burn. He stepped up to the microphone, letting the room quiet before he spoke. "I want to start by saying thank you," Jeremiah began, his voice calm but full of conviction. "Thank you to everyone who spoke up. Thank you to everyone who stood together when it mattered most. You didn't just show up for me. You showed up for yourselves, for your families, for your children." The crowd murmured, heads nodding in agreement. "But this isn't where we stop," Jeremiah continued. "Millworth isn't perfect. None of us are. But we've shown that silence isn't the answer, that fear isn't stronger than truth, and that when we stand together, change is possible." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "We've torn down what needed to be torn down. Now it's time to build something better. A community where everyone is seen, a town where justice isn't a privilege, it's a promise." Applause broke out, echoing through the hall. Jeremiah let the moment settle over him, the sound a reminder of why he'd fought so hard. These people, his people, deserved better, and they were ready to fight for it too. The events in Millworth had revealed something that couldn't be ignored. A system left unchecked would always fail. The people it was meant to serve. Jeremiah's story was a reminder that real change didn't come from waiting. It came from speaking up, stepping forward, and demanding something better. To anyone watching, Jeremiah Carter's message was clear. One voice matters. It takes courage to stand up when everything feels stacked against you. It takes strength to keep going when the odds say you shouldn't. But it only takes one person to start a fire. One person to inspire a movement. One person to say, "Enough." For Millworth, Jeremiah was that person. But in every town, on every street, there were others. People who just needed a reason to believe that their voice could make a difference. Jeremiah ended his speech with a final message. "It's up to us to decide what kind of world we leave behind. Not just for ourselves, but for the ones who come after us. Speak up. Stand tall, and never let fear win." That night, as Jeremiah walked through the quiet streets of Millworth, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The fight wasn't over. There were still shadows in the corners of this town, still people clinging to power, waiting for the moment to strike back. But for the first time in years, Millworth had hope. Curtis walked beside him, his voice breaking the quiet. "Where to next, boss?" Jeremiah smiled faintly, looking up at the stars. "Wherever we're needed." The two men continued down the road, their silhouettes framed by the glow of streetlights. Behind them, Millworth hummed with life, a town finally waking up after too many years in the dark. And somewhere in the distance, another battle waited to be fought. Another silence waited to be broken. Jeremiah Carter wasn't finished. Not yet. Jeremiah's story is more than one man's fight against injustice. It's a reminder that progress, real progress, demands courage. It demands resilience, and it demands that we confront the uncomfortable truths we've ignored for too long. We all have the power to make a difference, whether by standing up, speaking out, or simply refusing to look away when injustice rears its head. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with us. Jeremiah Carter stood tall in Millworth. Now it's your turn. What will you stand for?